hello to all of my wonderful participants so far. This is quite an interactive presentation today. You might want to have a piece of paper and a pen available. There will be things that you could benefit from trying as we go along, so you can write things down. And there are a few tests as well to test your cognitive functions on this Friday evening. So if you would like to play along with those, I suggest you get something to write with. So this is the second presentation in the Neuroscience and Seminar series, which is this online-only event presenting information that essentially I find very interesting and love to share with people. And the theme for today is about the body-mind connection. So if anybody is viewing this who hasn't got a grounding in neuroanatomy, and a bit of a sense of how the brain works, it might be a good idea to review that before going much further in these presentations that I'm doing, because I'm going to start talking as though you know what I mean if I refer to different parts of the brain and different ways of measuring the brain's function. So I really welcome questions in the chat room, but we're not every single time we do the webinars going to have the opportunity to go through all of the kind of basic terminology. So those of you who are here, I'm going to trust that you've strapped yourself in, you know some neuroanatomy, and we'll get going on the basis that you're relatively familiar with at least what the main parts are of the brain so that we can continue building on that knowledge. So there's two parts to the presentation today, and they are both about the body-mind link, but they talk about it in slightly different ways. They're both about how the body affects the brain, but the first one we'll see now for the first hour and a quarter approximately is about the effects of sensory perception on thoughts and behavior. And as we talk about those, we'll deal with the 5 ordinary senses and more than that. And then in the second part, we'll specifically look at how physical exercise has an effect on our thinking and our feeling as well. So there'll be some practical interventions that I'll share with you for different age groups. But to give you a sense of the real difference between these two parts of the presentation, the first one is a little bit about how we are, how we come into the world, the facilities and faculties that we arrive with. And the second one are more things that we can control, even from a moment-to-moment basis, about how our body is influencing our mind. Okay, so the first one is, you would say in clinical terms, more of the chronic presentation, and the second one is the acute presentation that might vary. Okay, so you may have noticed that the brains that I've shown you so far on the first slide and this one here, they are actually piles of bodies to represent to us that the brain is very much part of the body, and it is also the surface through which we have embodied experience. So we'll move on to the senses that you'll be familiar with. So here we go. These are the sorts of things you learned when you're in very early years of school. So the 5 senses are touch, hearing, smell, taste, and sight. And you may already be aware that those affect our emotions. They may also, to an extent, affect our thinking from your own experience, but you might not be aware quite to the extent that what we're perceiving through those 5 senses is actually coloring our worldview very significantly. So I'm going to take you through those 5 senses one by one to share with you some of the recent research about the ways in which they change our thinking and our feeling. And hopefully you'll build more of an awareness about how important the environment and the interactions that we have, the places that we put our body in and what we expose our body to, are so significant in how we feel about the world and the thoughts that we have in our lives. So we're going to start with an experiment. So let's say if your first name begins with a letter between A and N in the alphabet, then you are in the first group. And if your first name begins with something from O to Z, then you're in the second group. Okay, so just to make sure we have a distribution of participants here. So those of you whose first name begin with something between A and N, I would like you to imagine that you are holding in your hands a warm drink. So that could be a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, and you feel the pleasant warm sensation of that in your fingers. And there is something very familiar about that, how it kind of emanates through your fingertips, up your hands, and there's something quite relaxing about that. So you just imagine that as vividly as you can. In your hands is this pleasant, warm cup of tea or coffee, hot drink of your choice. And you're really concentrating on the physical sensation of that. Okay, so keep that in mind. And for those of you whose first name begin with O to Z, I would like you to imagine that you're holding a very pleasant cold drink. So there's a glass and there's a cold drink, and there might even be some ice cubes in it. You can feel that coolness, that cold sensation in your fingers. With that comes that kind of freshness, maybe even a little bit of numbness if you hold it very tight for a long time. And you feel how that spreads through your fingers, almost sort of towards the depths of your hands, almost even chilling the bones of your hands, but in a pleasant way. Okay, so we've got two groups of you. The ones with the hot drink, that's pleasantly spreading, imagining that in a really physical way, and those of you who are holding this imaginary cold drink in your hands. Right. Now, in a moment, I'm going to show you a video clip of a person, and I would like you to look at that video clip and then rate in your mind how friendly that person is from 1 to 10. So 1 means not friendly at all, and 10 means as friendly as you could possibly imagine, okay? And feel that sensation. We talked about that drink that you're holding, whether it's warm or it's cold. Okay. Okay, so if you would share in the chat panel, what is the number that you rate this person in terms of friendliness? And I'm just going to have a look at any of the answers that come in at this point. Okay, so we have a bit of a distribution of scores here. So those of you with a first name that was before N, you were holding a hot drink, and those of you who were after N, that was a cold drink that you were holding. So what we're seeing in the responses right now, there is a particular pattern, which is that when we imagine ourselves holding a warm drink, or we actually are holding something warm, we tend to rate people in a more friendly way. So that's just about represented here, although there's a lot of people who rated her as a 7, but we also have somebody whose name starts with an S that rated a 4. That is quite typical of somebody who's holding a cold drink. So let me show you a little bit more information about this. So our behavior is informed by our sense of touch. And it's not just to do with the temperature of what we're holding. It's also to do with the softness and the hardness and the texture of what we're manipulating in the moment. So studies have shown, and those of you who do any sort of business negotiations might find this particularly interesting. If you're sitting on a hard chair, you're more likely to be tough in negotiations versus if you're sitting on a soft chair, which will make you more accommodating. And if you are handling some kind of spiky object, you are likely to find the social interaction that you're in as more difficult, strenuous, than if you're manipulating a soft object within your hands. So this is, of course, the kind of information that's very interesting to people in marketing, the particular branch of business psychology that's involved with selling stuff to people. Often where you're asked to hold things in your hands as well if you're trying something, so that you start getting the sensory feedback from it for your hands. But I think there is also the potential for very positive use of this information for those of you who work with other people as therapists in whatever setting. You can do a lot to make somebody feel in an embodied way more comfortable and more open to an interaction than if you don't take those things into account. So do remember that when you're serving somebody a cold drink in a very spiky glass as they're sitting on a hard chair, it may go differently than intended. Okay, so that's a little bit about the sense of touch. Now, let's move on to the sense of taste. Often ignored in social interactions, except if we're sharing food together and we comment on it, but that also very much colors our judgment of others and our interactions with them. This is quite interesting also from a political perspective. Our embodied gustatory experience, so that means the way that we are tasting things, affects our sense of morality. So a study showed that if you give people a bitter drink to taste, they are going to show more moral disgust in their judgment of others than those who have a sweet drink or those who have water. And water here is considered the neutral kind of control group. So I wonder how many people take that into account when they plan what to give people who, for example, sit on a jury in a court of law. So moral disgust is different to the disgust of not liking what we're eating. Moral disgust is more of a sense of outrage. So here, imagine that somebody's having something bitter. They are going to have an amplified sense of outrage in comparison to somebody who's drinking water. So very important to take into account as well as you're trying to set up, the perfect social or therapeutic encounter with somebody. And another study shows that people who vote in the right wing of the political spectrum, so conservatives, tend to have a stronger sense of disgust than those who have liberal views. And that was measured in the study by allowing them to rate how strong the disgust was. So people who vote right wing tend to have a stronger moral disgust reaction and a stronger taste reaction than those who are left wing, which is quite interesting. Maybe there is some relation there between not having such a strong sense of disgust and therefore being able to, I guess, embrace a more liberal spectrum. There's so much that could be said about that. So that was one thing. There's one more thing I'll just share. It's not on the slide, but it's far too interesting not to tell you about. So there was a study recently that was done at Yale University. And in that study, they tried to find out if it's possible to change people's political orientations. And you might think to yourself, how can one possibly do that in the course of a short laboratory study when that relies on so many personal, moral, ideological viewpoints, right? Well, what they did was they measured people before they did an intervention on them to find out how left, middle ground, or right wing they were. And then they created a situation in which the people who voted very right wing, so conservative, felt very safe in their body. So I don't remember how the exact intervention went, but they did something that made those people either imagine themselves or feel themselves to be very, very safe, relaxed, secure, peaceful in their bodies. Then they took the same measurement of their political orientation and found that the people who were right-wing started to show more of a central or left-wing tendency. So it's actually quite fascinating that our sense of security in the body appears to also be informing our political orientation. Perhaps not the biggest insight ever for people who are attending this talk here, but still something to bear in mind if we're with somebody who is perhaps discriminating towards people that we're open-minded to, or whatever it might be. It could be to do with the person's own sense of safety. Yeah, so it does make sense when you think about it. And again, a really good piece of evidence to do with how much the body's wisdom is coloring what we might believe to be a separate box that sits there in our head making decisions for us. Not at all the case. And on that same note, when judges sit on a probation board and they're deciding who gets probation, so which prisoner is going to be let out on probation, if your hearing is before lunchtime, you have 30% less chance of being let out on probation than if it's after lunchtime. And so you would think that judges hold a completely neutral moral ground and judge each case similarly. But if it's before lunchtime and after lunchtime, there is an embodied sense of hunger and lack of satisfaction that is coloring the judgment. So if you should ever find yourself needing a probation review, you should try to get scheduled right after lunch. Okay, so let's move on to the next sense, which is smell. So I guess we can all imagine, or we all know from experience, what it's like to be with somebody whose smell we really like and how we respond to them versus if there is a difficult smell, an unpleasant smell in a place or on a person. It also colors our moral judgment. So a little bit like taste, this is a study that was done where they lined up people who are part of different minorities that are often discriminated against in society. And in one condition, they had a neutral room, and in the other one, they emitted some kind of unpleasant odor in the room. And what they found was that the people who were presented as male homosexuals were judged by this audience of people who didn't know them in a more negative way if there was the unpleasant smell. And that's not an effect that was seen for the other minority groups that they included, which was, I think it was a black ethnic minority group and also female homosexual group. So it was only the gay males that were presented as such, when the negative or this unpleasant smell was pleasant, that were subject to this discriminatory kind of judgment based on the smell, since that was the only thing that changed. So that's also interesting. What are we doing to ensure that, for example, again, in a legal setting, in a judiciary setting, that there is a sort of neutral background odor? You know, that's also, I can imagine there's a lot of musty courtrooms around with a damp smell that might be coloring judgments of people. And then on the same note, of course, pheromones, another smell that perhaps we can't pick up consciously, but that has a very big effect on us. And those of you who own dogs may already be aware of the effect of that in the animal kingdom. You know, dogs coming running from kilometers away when there is a female dog in heat, you know, turning up on the doorstep, or, you know, climbing, gnawing and scratching their way through doors to get to the object of their desire. We are also affected by that as human beings. One just hopes that we have a little bit more frontal lobe inhibition that stops us from going to quite such extremes. So our behavior is absolutely informed by our sense of smell. People who have anosmia, the condition where we are not able to pick up smells, are less affected morally by these sorts of changes. They then just lose out on another dimension, I guess, another depth of human experience. And then sound. So lots of people love music and use music actively to change their mood. Well, that's just the part of sound that we can hear, that we can use to manipulate our behavior and our emotions in that way. What about the sound that's beyond our normal range of hearing? So there's two ends of that. There's high-pitched sound. That's the kind of sound that we are less able to hear the older we get. So I don't remember the exact age cutoffs, but there are certain times in childhood and then during adolescence that we lose certain high frequency pitches of sound in our hearing ability. And the police actively use that fact to try to stop teenagers from congregating in places that could be considered a sort of antisocial vibe. By putting up loudspeakers that emit this kind of really high frequency sound that only children and teenagers can hear, and other people of, you know, sort of 20, 30 onwards cannot hear. So basically to stop teenagers from congregating in places where other people who might not be so societally disruptive can congregate. So it's an interesting way to discriminate between the age groups. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there is infrasound. So this is incredibly interesting. And there is speculation in sort of human evolution to do with what this is about for us. So infrasound is classified as less than 20 hertz. So that means a sound wave that's vibration is less than 20 times per second. And studies have been done on that kind of sound and its effect on the body. Interestingly, it's a sound range that pipe organs, church pipe organs, emit from the very biggest pipes. So why would you, in a church, put a pipe on an organ whose sound nobody can actually hear? Because it's below the level of our hearing, hence infrasound. Well, If you play, and this was done in London on the South Bank, in 4 concerts, in 2 of the concerts, they had speakers that emitted infrasound. And in the other 2 concerts, they didn't. And so they compared the experience of people as they came out of these concerts. What did you experience? And the people who had been present in the concerts where they had been playing infrasound reported things like, I felt the presence of a spiritual being, or my spine was tingling, or it was awe-inspiring. And there was much more of that kind of reporting from them than in the concerts where they didn't have the infrasound speakers. So there appears to be a way in which our body perceives that sound, which in a way makes sense if you think about how much water we have in our systems, and water, of course, resonates with sound. There are multiple ways in which one could imagine that we are still receiving that sound, although in a conscious, auditory way, we're not perceiving it, and it's creating a physical effect in our bodies. And so more speculation was done about this. Why do we have that ability? That's so strange. And then it turns out that infrasound is actually used in the animal kingdom as a way of communication. And elephants, when they have their big feet flat on the ground, are able to pick up infrasound waves. And they actually emit infrasound, which can travel across huge distances as a form of group communication. So the hypothesis was brought forward that maybe we don't hear it, but we feel it if we're tuned in to our bodies. And that was perhaps useful for us back in the days when there were predators that roamed this earth, whose presence we would only be able to hear from a distance if they were communicating with infrasound. So it's a kind of, I guess, a warning system that was useful for us at a certain point in time when big predators were using infrasound as a communication method. And that would give us a warning that they were in the vicinity. So these days, it's mostly used in churches and concerts when there are those sorts of experiments going on to induce the presence of the supernatural, because that's how we respond to it now, with a kind of sense of slight fear and awe, in the same way that one might if one saw a huge natural beast or thought they might be in the vicinity. So that's the 2 spectrums, the 2 ends of the sound spectrum. And of course, shops use music to encourage us to spend money. When there is a faster beat, that tends to be something that our body starts to go into a resonance with, and we start to speed up, and there's a sense of urgency which might make us spend more. And in other kinds of shops, there might be much more of a relaxed classical atmosphere. Classical music has been shown to make people spend more money because it makes them feel at ease and more, I guess, cultural and affluent. So that's often played in high-end luxury goods shops, because then we're going to want to spend the sorts of money, money that those prices involve in those shops. And then, of course, there is the tone of voice that would be used for seduction, which is different to a tone of voice for normal communication. So I won't embarrass myself here by doing a sort of Elvis Presley impersonation, but I think we're all able to pick up when somebody is using the pitch, the timbre of their voice in such a way to communicate a meaning. And I'm sure you're aware of the studies that show how we perceive communication from other people. It's not so much about what's being said, but it's about how and the body language that goes with it. I think that's kind of more than 70 or 80% of it, those 2 together, versus the words that are being used. So the embodied sense in communication, I think you're starting to get a sense of how important it is. So sorry to disappoint you all not to do my seduction voice here. I have no idea who in the future is going to listen to this, so there we are. And yes, it is a little bit naughty by the people in the church back in the day to be using the church pipe organs in that way. But I guess it's the same as using architecture to inspire a sense of the divine as well, an almost superhuman scale. So if you have that visually, to be in the house of God, accompanied by sounds that give a certain sensation, that, I guess, is a way of inducing a religious feeling in those who may not have as easy access to it as others. So there we are. So we move on now to the connections between the senses. And this one we're going to start with is to do with speech sounds and visual shape. So I'm going to ask you to look at the two shapes on the screen that are there on the right, those two grey shapes, and I would like you to tell me whether booba is the one on the left or the right. They're called booba and kiki. We don't know which one is which, but you tell me, is booba the one on the left or the one on the right? Yep, so there are some people who've responded that it's the one on the right. That would be 95% of people who agree with you. Which is very interesting when this study is done in really different cultures, all the way from American high school students to Tamil students in Sri Lanka. They respond in the same way. Booba is the one on the right. The sounds of that word, booba, what we do with our mouth and the softness of those sounds is something that we subconsciously correlate to the shape of what we're visually taking in. This is something you see as early as 2.5 years onwards in children. They're able to point out the same thing. Interestingly, in people with autism, there's only a 50% amount of people who would agree that it's the one on the right. So that's almost the same as chance. So it's interesting that there might be a kind of disturbance or difference in the way that sound and shape is mapped together for some people on the autistic spectrum. So here's a really great word to learn, which is ideesthesia. I just let that roll off your tongue as though it's the most natural thing. So ideesthesia comes from Greek. It means sensing and concepts. Okay, so idea is concepts and aesthesia is to do with sensing. So the definition is a phenomenon where there are activations of concepts that evoke a perception-like experience in the body. And we could practice that right now if I said to you the word holiday. And you might, as I say the word holiday, have images that come to mind. You might have sounds that come into your inner ear. You might have sensations about holiday, all sorts of things. So essentially, holiday is a concept, but it's able to bring forth in us the memories of sensory perception. And that's how this Buba Kiki question works as well, except here it's just presented on the screen for you. So it's a question here about, does it have anything to do with the shape of the sound waves? Sound waves, as far as I know, so they have different, when you look at them, you can see the pitch that is used in the sound. So it might be that when you say ki, that it's quite a high pitch, and when you say booba, it comes at a kind of lower pitch, but I don't know if it's the shape itself or more to do with the way that we're using our mouth to make them. So, for example, if you say the word whoa, right? Whoa, like this kind of exclamation of surprise. You're doing with your mouth what your body naturally does in a situation of surprise, which is this kind of opening up and, you know, the jaw-dropping moment. So that sort of word may have arisen originally, you know, back from the Indo-European language that most of what we speak, I guess, here this evening may have roots in that. And of course, there are other language roots as well. But as words were first being conceived of, it was because they were related to the concept or the thing that they were trying to describe. So whoa comes from this action that we make when we're feeling that thing. So this is probably why we kind of have an identification between booba, which is this roundness that we're doing with our mouth, and the roundness of the sound that comes from that mouth posture, and the roundness of that shape. But it's something that's interesting to look more into, and you'd have to ask somebody who does a little bit more of a kind of acoustics analysis to look at what those sound waves specifically look like. So we're coming to the final one of the 5 senses now, and I'm not going to tell you about it in the direct sense, but in the indirect sense. It's the sense of sight. Now, you all know how influenced you are by what you see. Just consider when you meet somebody, all the sorts of decisions, judgments, feelings that are made based purely on their visual appearance. Or if you see a landscape or some item in a shop or some food or whatever it might be, we have such a huge visual reaction to things. So I'm not going to elaborate to you in any detail what kind of effect that has. But what I do want to talk to you about is how much we're influenced by what we don't consciously see. So there was a study done where they put people on exercise bikes in a laboratory, like so a good old laboratory study with a load of people pedaling away. And it was a kind of modern bike that you get in gyms nowadays where there's a screen on them where you can look at a landscape or the TV or whatever to distract yourself from the pain of the cycling, right? And on half of them, they were flashing up images of either happy faces or unhappy, pained faces. And what they found, and they flashed them up so quickly that it was faster than what we could consciously perceive, right? So this is what was used decades ago. It's illegal now. It's used as a kind of subconscious programming, a kind of brainwashing, if you like. So when you flash up images that happen faster than you can consciously perceive of it, it is registered somewhere, and we're able to recall it in dreams, for example, or it comes out in our behavior. So what happened in this study was that the ones who had these subliminal visual clues to do with positivity and engagement and action, they found afterwards that their effort seemed much less, and they also were able to perform this endurance act for longer than those who had seen the unhappy or pained faces, who felt like they weren't able to go on for as long, and what they did do felt like it came at much more effort than the others. Right? So that's what they weren't seeing that was deciding their ability to physically perform. So that's certainly something that's worth bearing in mind for anyone who's off to do sports or anything else, for example, giving a 2.5-hour presentation as a webinar, to surround oneself with very positive imagery to make it feel effortless and as though it could go on easily forever, right? So just to complete the information I have here on the slide, about 90% of our capacity to process non-conscious information is taken up by the visual system. So it's only 10% of our processing power that's given up to touch, smell, taste, hearing. And given what I've already told you in this presentation about those senses, that's already a lot. And then sight is taking up the rest. So what we see and what we're not consciously seeing has an absolutely huge effect on us. So surround yourself with things you want to be looking at, and know that even if you're not seeing something, it could still be affecting you. Okay, so first milestone here. So those were the 5 senses that we ordinarily talk about, but of course we have more than those. And I found it quite fun to actually look into how many senses do we really have that are currently recognized and measurable in scientific inquiry. And so you can group them into different categories. There are exteroceptive senses, which means that they are receiving information about the external world, hence exteroceptive, external reception, right? They include things like balance, acceleration, and pain, and a few others as well. So that's all to do with the outside world. If you're on a ship and it's moving, you're going to find that your balance is shifting about. If you're on a rocket that's about to take off for the moon, you'll have a sense of G-force on you, or even things that are less exciting than that. And if the outside world is touching you in some kind of way, or there's a lot of heat, or even if there's chemical exposure, then there are pain receptors that will pick that up in your body. So that's to do with the outside world. Then there's interoceptive senses. So those are the ones that are picking up information about our inner universe. Now, this is part of my PhD subject, so I apologize already if I get extremely enthusiastic about this, but we're going to go into this in a lot of detail. So there are 2 big categories of interoception, being proprioception and interoception per se. Proprioception is our ability to know how we are configured in space even without looking at ourselves. So if you were to close your eyes, you would probably still know how your arm is in space and where your legs are. You don't suddenly lose sense of them, and you still know whether you're standing or sitting, or whether you're stretched or twisted or whatever, because there are little organs that sit inside the muscles, the ligaments, the tendons, that are constantly measuring the length, the stretch, and the tension that there is on them, and they report that information back to the brain that then builds a coherent image of how your body is, right? Just imagine you're an octopus, how complicated that is to check all of these proprioceptive measures, which is probably why octopuses have a separate little brain processing unit in each arm. So I found that quite fascinating. So that's proprioception, how we're configured in space. And for those of you who remember my presentation last time, you might have seen it, that's the somatosensory cortex and the parietal lobe in the brain that are processing that information. Then interoception. So this is a wide collection of sensors in the body that are receiving information from organs inside the body and from some of the cranial nerves, like the vagus nerve that runs through the body, and that are reporting back to give a sense of what is the internal environment at that point in time. To give you a very obvious example of interoception, you hopefully know when you need to go to the bathroom. Right? So that's the sense that we hopefully develop in childhood that serves us well through life. And when we get old, that's sometimes one of the senses that we lose a little bit. And there are quite a number of the interoceptive senses that we get worse at through age, which is part of what I'm researching. So that's exteroceptive senses from the outside world, interoceptive senses from inside of the body, and then there are other senses, which is rather fabulous. So if it's not outside or inside the body, where is it coming from? Well, time is a sense. Some people have an exquisite sense of time. They can tell you, I've been here for 28 minutes, and they absolutely know that. And other people seem to go around with quite a lot of time distortion. And then there's this other sense called agency. And what that means is, to what extent do we feel empowered in ourselves in that moment? Am I under your control, or am I my own master? So there may be some situations where we feel that we don't have agency, that we've handed it over to another. And there may be situations where we feel absolutely empowered in ourselves. So that's also something that's a little bit more subtle than the outside or inside world per se, and more of a combination of things. Then there's the sense of familiarity, right? So that's actually something that one can lose or have too much of. And there's a fascinating case study by a chap in Italy, well, about a chap in Italy, who developed a particular syndrome where he thought that people he was meeting were familiar to him. And not just familiar, but really familiar, like a dear friend. And being Italian, of course, that comes with quite effusive affection. And this is very confusing for people who didn't know him at all. So there are certain aspects of the brain that hold this familiarity sense. And we can also lose it, which is quite disconcerting when things that used to be familiar are no longer familiar. And this happens often with people who have memory loss as well, that the sense of familiarity is gone. So again, it's not really just the inside or the outside of the self, but more of a conglomerate of information that's being processed. And then there's also extrasensory perception, higher sense perception as it's sometimes called. So this ability to receive more kind of subtle information from finer frequencies, spiritual guidance, one might call it, or clairvoyance, clairaudience, what do you call kinesthetic information, all these different senses that we might have if we are practiced in, for example, the healing arts or work in the psychic domain. So we have a lot more than 5 senses. So interesting. We're going to look a little bit more now at proprioception. So here we have Wonder Woman. So she represents a proprioceptive experience that we would benefit from copying. And let me tell you why. So, when our body proprioceptively feels us in certain positions, it releases hormones that match that position. So, for example, if you are standing in a power pose, which is what we've got Wonder Woman demonstrating for us here, so legs apart and arms out to the side, hands on hips, so a real kind of here I am pose. Not to be overdone, I saw some terrible pictures of politicians recently who'd obviously been shown this and were terribly overdoing it, and it didn't look good. But, you know, in a natural, strong stance way, or sitting in a power pose, which means that your hands would be behind your head and you're leaning back, your chest is open, your legs are comfortably out in front of you. That's a sitting power pose. That increases the self-confidence of the person who's doing it and their testosterone levels, regardless of whether they're male or female, and it decreases cortisol levels. That's a pretty impressive set of endocrinological phenomena in one go, just because you change your posture. And with that change in the hormones in the body also comes a higher tolerance for risk and more feelings of power. So you could, of course, imagine that, before I did this talk here this evening, I was standing there and taking on all these postures just to try and make myself feel more powerful. So this information comes from a talk called Your Body Language May Shape Who You Are by Amy Cuddy. And there is a comment right now about Cuddy having retracted some of this information. I don't think one should throw out the baby with the bathwater completely with some of these findings, because they have been shown to be true in different contexts. And I'll give you an example of that right now. So there have been studies done on people who suffer from eating disorders, and this was unrelated to this researcher called Amy Cuddy. And what they found was with women who had a very high level of body shape concern, the posture that they were sitting in was able to make them eat more or less. So if you're dealing, for example, with somebody who has extreme body shape concern and is therefore, or with that, anorexic, and you know that if that person is invited to sit in an expansive body posture, taking up some space, that's going to help them eat more than if they sit in a restrictive, hunched over, really bent and closed body posture. Then you would be able to help that person get the right amount of calorie intake, right? So some of this information is absolutely valid, and I think more replications need to be done to find out whether this is something that stands in specific populations generally, or is it applicable to very specific people. So it's actually one of the problems in a lot of psychology research, which is to do with, those results were found in a certain place at a certain time. Can you consistently find those same results across different populations at different times, perhaps by another researcher who might be doing it slightly differently or with a different agenda than the original person? And there is a lot of psychology research that was done over the decades that is now slowly being replicated to try and find out whether those results are as strong as they were originally, or are they more marginal, or is it not possible to replicate it at all? So always good to keep an open mind with things that one reads. But this one here, I would say that at least the postural stuff absolutely stands, because it has an effect on the amount that people are eating, which is useful to know. Okay, so that was to do with mood and how we feel in ourselves. Memory is influenced by posture. When we make memories, it seems to be that the posture that our body is in is somehow encoded alongside or with or as a kind of key for that memory. So a study was done where people were asked to learn a new set of information, and some of them were asked to be in very specific postures, whereas others were in whatever posture they wanted. And when it was time to regurgitate that information, to kind of say what they'd learned later on, those who assumed the posture that they had gone into while they were learning it had better access to the information. So that's really useful for people who need to learn, for example, students, a lot of information. But it also means we have to pay attention to the position, the posture that we're in when we are learning. Because if we like to lie down in bed with our book over our head like this to take in information, that's probably not the posture we're going to be in come exam time. So it's a really good idea to try and match, to the extent possible, the situation and the posture in which we are when we're learning to the situation and posture we're going to be in when we have to deliver that information. And of course, this is something that is really important in therapy work as well, particularly those who might work with people that have trauma, repressed memories, developmental issues from childhood. if you are inadvertently placing people in a posture, or they place themselves in a posture, that might open up that memory or that trauma experience. It's also something that you can use deliberately to ask people to assume a posture, knowing that that might help them access that place where that originally happened, whereas a different posture might not have that same effect. So I know there are people here who are quite experienced with healing and therapy work who'll be very familiar with that. And interesting for those who might not be aware that posture and memory go together. Now, this has been known for thousands of years, in fact. Back in the days of the Greek rhetoric, where people had to learn very long speeches as politicians. Of course, they didn't have a little tablet to write things on, or chip things out, or have an iPad on the side that could give them information. So they had to learn through pure memorization the information that they wanted to give in these speeches that could take 2 or 3 hours. And they developed a technique to do that, which is called the memory palace technique. And in this, there was a social habit that we've lost now. You don't see it anymore, but back then it was incredibly commonplace, which was for people to walk around public buildings, paying attention to everything. How their footsteps sounded as they walk over the marble floors. How the light just finds its way around the side of a column and you see little flakes of dust floating in the air next to it. How it feels to put your hand on some kind of stone carving on the wall and run your fingers over it and feel the coolness and the smoothness of this sculpture or carving. All of those were habits that people had back then because they were building up memory palaces. So the way it works is that you would memorize a building in incredible detail using as many of your senses as possible because they knew what they were doing. And then later on, when it was time to remember this incredibly long speech, they would, in their mind, walk around that same building, and they would place significant objects in their mind associated with the different parts of the speech. So, for example, if somebody wanted to start a speech by talking about the state of the Navy, and then talk about the fact that there's a lack of wheat in the fields, and then talk about some barbarian invaders, they might place a miniature boat on the floor, which reflects the light and makes it look as though the floor is actually quite liquid. So when they see that in their mind's eye, they have the reminder of what that is. And then for the lack of wheat, it might be that they see how the sun comes down and how hot it is underfoot when you walk in a certain place in this building. And that reminds them that the wheat is wilting in the fields because it's too hot. And then it might be there's a certain doorway that you go through, and when they're used to taking that movement through the doorway, they always feel a little trepidation because they don't know who's on the other side. And that can be the way they remind themselves of these potential invading barbarians, right? So in their mind, when they're delivering this 2 or 3 hour speech, all they have to do is take that same journey through the building and pick up those little pieces that they left along the way, and then they have the whole sequence. So I was once upon a time on a very long train journey from Malta to Denmark, no less, which involved 2 days on trains. And I started to play a memory list game with my travel companion, and we got 200 objects, which we could recite forwards and backwards and pick up at any point and go forwards and backwards with them, because I was using my grandparents' home as my memory palace, because I knew all of the textures, all of the smells and everything. And we just didn't have anything else to do, and we weren't being particularly serious about it other than healthily competitive. So that just proves you can absolutely use that, and you already have the resource inside you that you need. Just think about a place that you know that well, and then it's just up to you to associate things with it that you'll be able to pick up again as you go through it. So that's memory to do with posture and moving through spaces. Okay, so I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit here. I'm getting a little bit excited with telling you all these other interesting stories, but I'll start working a little bit quicker through the slides. So when we read words, our brain reacts to them in the same way as though we were going to act them out. So this is really interesting. If you read words that are to do with actions, for example, lick to do with the tongue, pick to do with the hands, or kick to do with the foot, and you're scanning the person's brain, you see that the part of the motor cortex and premotor cortex light up as though they were going to do that action just because they're reading the word. So if you're familiar with the brain, you'll see here what I've got on the slide. That's a slice through the motor cortex, which sits in the frontal lobe, just in front of the central sulcus, behind which is the sensory cortex. And there's the representation of the body on there. And so it's what's called somatotopic, the way in which those action words light up in the motor cortex. And what is even more interesting is perhaps that in people who start to have different neurodegenerative diseases or different physical problems, you can see the reverse process. So for example, in patients with Parkinson's, their speed of processing in terms of their cognitive speed is slower for words that are related to actions, but not for concrete nouns. So they can process and understand the word table as fast as they always did, but they're slower to process, understand, and respond to the word walk. So there's a very direct connection, which perhaps isn't as obvious as, one might not have thought of this, but between what the body is able to do and how the brain is responding to written information about that. So that was all to do with proprioception and how the body is responding to postural things and movement. So I'm going to move on to interoception now, and I've got even more interesting information for you coming up about abilities we lose with certain things. I'll just say the word Botox now, so you know what you're looking forward to. So like I mentioned earlier, interoception is about how we feel inside the body. It's giving us information about the inner state of play inside us. And lots of systems are involved in that. I've listed a few here on the slide: cardiorespiratory, gastrointestinal, our digestion, genitourinary, and nociceptive, which is to do with our experience of pain from inside the body, for example, heartburn, and endocrine systems. So we all know how it feels when we're having a burst of adrenaline, and our immune system as well. So when this word interoception was first used, it used to just mean our ability to feel our internal organs. So for example, can you right now in this moment pick up your heartbeat without taking your pulse? So it's about 25% of people who are known as heartbeat detectors, and 75% of people who can't normally do that unless they're trained. Okay, so if you can sit here just now all peacefully without having run up any stairs or anything and pick up your heartbeat sensation somewhere in your body, doesn't matter where, then you're one of those 25% who can do that. And what has happened since this word interoception was originally introduced in that sense is that it's now broader. It's to do with all of the body's senses from inside. There's some very happy responses there in the chat room. So it's to do with all sorts of things. For example, how nauseous you might feel, or are you hungry? Do you need to go to the bathroom? Also, social touch is an interoceptive phenomena. So for example, when somebody touches you, there's a difference between them going like that and holding you, and them going like this and stroking you. And even in the quality of stroking, we can pick up a lot of information. Is it a kind of just stroking and somebody's not really feeling very comfortable in their body and they're touching you and you immediately start to feel they're not comfortable in their body, please stop touching me? Or somebody who's very at ease with their body and they're stroking you and it feels welcome and okay, right? So all of that is to do with interoception. These days, it even means our ability to pick up the emotions that we're feeling. So not just our physical sensations, but also our emotions, okay? And we'll get more onto that soon. So interoception plays a role in emotions in various ways. So the first thing is there is a distinction between the word feelings and emotions that some researchers are making. I use them a little bit interchangeably, so I'm sorry about that if I'm confusing anybody. But strictly speaking, some researchers say that emotions are what play out in the body, in the theater of the body, if you like, according to Sarah McKay. Whereas feelings are interpretations of emotions that are playing out in the mind. So in a way, you could say feelings are to do with the brain's representation or processing of what is happening inside the body. And Lisa Feldman Barrett, who has written extensively on the subject of emotions and how they arise, holds the view that feelings are actually a product of what the brain anticipates will happen next. So according to her, we're not feeling something in reaction to what's happening in front of us, but a feeling is arising in anticipation to what our brain believes is going to happen next, which is very interesting when you think about it, and much too big a subject to cover here, but just something to open your minds a little bit to the fact that there are many parts, aspects of research into emotions that are not yet settled. Okay. And to bear in mind, again, for those of you who work with people, if there is a misrepresentation or a disconnect between the inner state and the person's interpretation of that state and the signals, the prediction of those signals, that can potentially underlie various mental disorders. So just to give you an example, anxiety. So if somebody is able to feel their heartbeat, for example, one of those lucky 25%, but in their mind, feeling the heartbeat means that there's something bad happening, or they shouldn't be feeling their heartbeat, and therefore they must be very stressed, or maybe they're even about to have a heart attack, that then creates an ongoing state of anxiety because there is a misrepresentation of the body sensation. Okay, and the same, for example, with panic disorder. That's a more extreme version of the same thing. The person might be misinterpreting signals in the body that might mean something completely different or something much less severe than they think. And they might interpret that as a, that's it, I'm having a heart attack, and they have, a panic attack. And the same has been said for example, PTSD, that there is a sensation that arises or a sensory perception that comes, and then the person's interpretation and response to it is out of proportion to the context that they're in. So there's a lot to be said for paying attention to our inner signals and having them in proportion to the world around us to make sure that we don't become overly aware of them. In fact, people who have what's called MUS, which is medically unexplained symptoms, sometimes have incredibly high interoceptive ability. But you could say maybe it's even a bit too high, that they're so over-aware. Right? Okay, so now we get to the slide I promised you just a moment ago, to do with Botox. So this may be surprising to some of you. Our ability to understand emotion is affected by proprioception and interoception. Okay, so it's not just to do with the life you've lived and how many people you've seen and how empathic you are. It's also to do with your proprioceptive and interoceptive ability. So the study that was done was they tested people before they underwent Botox treatment and then again afterwards. And they tested them in various ways. And what was shown was that people who had the Botox treatment afterwards were less likely to report experiencing negative emotions in their life. You would say, way, I'm off to have Botox right now, I'll never feel bad again. But they were also slower to read sentences that had mentions of anger or sadness in them. So this is a little bit like the people with Parkinson's who slow down their processing when it's to do with movement. People who've had Botox treatment slow down processing around negative emotions. And this is really where I think the biggest loss is. They were less able to detect emotions on other people's faces. So because they were in a way paralyzed from feeling or expressing anger or sadness on their own face, they're not able to mirror another person. So this is something that's called the chameleon effect. We tend to mirror who we're with. But if we can't mirror them, then we can't, on a sort of small level, do the same thing that they're doing. And we're not therefore able to pick up the same information that we would if we did mirror them. So if I see somebody putting a funny face and, I sort of covertly mirror them, I kind of go like that, I can tell from my own face what I might be feeling if I did that, which gives me information about them. And if I can't replicate them, then it's more difficult, which is what the people who'd undergone Botox treatment experienced. Okay, so I hope I haven't disillusioned anybody who's listening to this right now from the effects of Botox treatment. It certainly has positive sides. There'll be less negative emotions reported in your life, but there is also the price to pay vis-a-vis other people that goes with that. So we come to another milestone now, hanging in there, where we can essentially say that what we visually see, what we physically sense, and what we emotionally feel are all interconnected. And moving on even a step further from that, our brain updates our perception of the world accordingly. So what we're seeing, sensing, and feeling is what our brain will update our perception of the world to be, including our body image. So I'm going to show you now a video which explains something that is a rather curious phenomenon. It's called the rubber hand illusion. So let me get that open for you here. It's about 2.5, 3 minutes long, and I will just remove myself from the screen in the meantime. Here we go.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Larry.
Hi, Edie.
Very nice to meet you, Edie. We're going to do a little demonstration here called the rubber hand illusion. It's going to be a little scary.
This illusion may look like fairground fun, but it reveals one of the most important new ideas in brain science.
Thank you. Right there. Good. And can you put this hand down right over here and just curl it up like the rubber hand's curled up a little bit? All right. Now, what I'm going to do is try to position the rubber hand so it looks like it's your own.
Okay.
Okay, could you imagine that being your own hand, kinda?
Yeah.
What we're going to do is we're going to stroke your fingers simultaneously, the rubber finger and your real finger, and hopefully this will convince you that the rubber hand is your own, that your brain will actually adopt this hand.
In the illusion, simply watching the rubber hand being stroked at the same time as the real hand is enough to trick the brain into adopting it as its own.
We like weird. And slowly but surely, you should feel that the hand you're looking at is actually part of your body.
Feels like you're touching my hand with that one.
Right, so it feels like this is your hand that I'm touching, right?
Yes.
You okay?
Yeah.
Good. Try that at home with your kids. Yeah. The rubber hand illusion is a wonderful example of how multisensory perception can influence how we perceive our own body. I mean, that's how deep multisensory perception runs. When you hold your hand out, it's generally thought that you know it's there because of the information you're getting from your muscles and your tendons and that sort of thing. But what the rubber hand illusion does is show how that can be overridden by visual information. Okay,
The rubber
here comes
hand
your fun
illusion
surprise.
shows the powerful connection between what we see and what we feel. But it reveals even more than simply the way our senses are connected. It hints that a fundamental change in the brain is taking place.
Oh!
Isn't that strange?
Yeah, that's creepy.
So what might be going on in the rubber hand illusion is that the brain is actually changing to accommodate the new rubber hand, going through some sort of, structural change that we call neuroplasticity.
Neuroplasticity is an exciting new idea that suggests the brain can change in response to experience. And this is what's taking place in the rubber hand illusion. The brain may be temporarily rewiring itself to adopt the plastic hand as its own.
Really feeling like it's your hand now, huh?
Yes.
Is that a little weird?
Yes.
Yeah, we like weird in perceptual psychology. There we go. Was that scary?
Yes.
Good, we like that.
Okay, so we then find out that the brain, with its neuroplastic ability, is actually able to update our perception of what is our hand within minutes. And it's a shame I don't have you all here in person because I like to demonstrate this on people. I have a kind of rubber hand and I have a large plastic rubber mallet that I use on people as well to demonstrate this phenomenon. And I've seen it working within 10 seconds on people. On other people, it takes a minute or two for them really for that illusion to take hold as that neuroplastic change happens. So for those who were kind of thinking that neuroplasticity is a process that takes days, weeks, and months, that is not the case for body image at the very least. So what is happening there, as the narrator told us in this clip, is that the brain is trying to create congruence out of perceptive input that doesn't match, and the brain doesn't like that. So it would rather update your body map inside your brain than have visual and physical touch input that doesn't match, which is pretty extraordinary. So a very versatile brain that we have indeed. And this is something, again, that I offer to those of you who work with others in a kind of therapeutic capacity. Affective touch, which is touch that carries with it emotion, which is different to functional touch. So functional touch is like a handshake. Affective touch is something that's intended to convey a feeling. That has a quite unique and strong contribution to our sense of body ownership. So those, for example, children who are only touched in functional ways do not necessarily develop the same sense of ownership of their whole body than those who are touched in a way where there is this affective dimension to it. And remember when I said earlier, interoception also carries with it the ability to sense affective touch. So it helps us to develop our body map when we are touched with, I guess, positive emotion, or maybe, I don't know whether negative emotion would have the same effect, but certainly if it is an affective touch, we get a better sense of ourselves, quite literally. And then we own our sense of self in a psychological way, in a more embodied way as well. So we have a stronger psychological self as we have a stronger sense of our physical selves. Okay, so let's have a little go to see how good you are at interpreting body sensations that you might be feeling. So I have a little bit of a test here for you. I'm going to mark some of the questions you're asking to return to in just a moment. So I'm going to say a sentence. It's here on the screen. My heart is pounding. And what I would like you to do is tell me why might that be happening. So you don't need to give me reasons why your heart is pounding, but what might it mean emotionally? What interpretation could you make of that if your heart was pounding? What would you be thinking? What has happened to you? So write me a few suggestions of what you might think is happening because your heart is pounding. Right, you could be excited, absolutely, right? Any other ideas of why? What interpretation might you make? My heart is pounding. You might be scared, yes, and you might be exercising. Brilliant, okay. So you're covering different domains here. It might be a purely physical phenomenon that's going on, that's raised your heart rate, and it could be to do with strong emotions, fear and excitement. And people who have panic disorder, who are prone towards anxiety, often tend to overinterpret heart pounding as a fear reaction, as opposed to something that could just be excitement. It's a very nice cognitive reframing to do with oneself and say, oh, my heart is pounding, I'm about to do a presentation. It must mean that I'm very excited, right? So I'll just show you a few of the ones that I put together as well. I might be scared, I might be in love, I ran up a hill, which is the same as the physical exertions. I had a strong coffee, I've caffeinated myself, or there is a police car driving behind me. I haven't done anything, but I'm having a reaction to that just because it's there, right? So those are all various interpretations we might make of our body sensations. You'll see where I'm going with this in just a moment. We'll do one more example of this. So what if I said to you, I have butterflies in my tummy? Give me some reasons why, or what interpretations you make of that physical sensation. So you could be nervous, yes. There could be anxiety. There might be a risk that's about to happen. Yep, so that's kind of neither positive nor negative in a way, but something one might throw oneself into. One might have flu, absolutely. It could be imminent sort of immune system breakdown, or even nausea that's onset. Absolutely, very good. So I'll just show you a few of the ones that I put together for that one. So excited, nervous, I could be hungry. I might have food poisoning, a little bit along the lines of flu, and someone might be pregnant, right? There could also be little fluttering sensations going on in the abdominal region for that. So you were able to give me lots of interpretations of that. And that's quite a normal thing to do. So 90% of the population is able to come up with lots of interpretations of these bodily symptoms. And that gives you a range of possible reactions, right, to how you might want to respond to what is going on in your body. And that's because for most people, our experience is the living interface of the world, our body, and our mind. So our experience is the living interface between the world, our body, and our mind. That's where our day-to-day existence is unfolding. And that can be, as in this picture I chose here, a very multicolored, very deep, multi-layered, multi-textured experience. However, that's not how it is for everybody. And there is a particular condition which is called alexithymia, which affects about 10% of people. And this is, again, a Greek word. So a means the inability or absence of something. Lexi is to do with reading, like the word lexicon, and thymia is to do with emotions. So it means that people with alexithymia are unable to read their emotions, and they're actually also pretty bad at reading their interoceptive feedback more generally, including their visceral sensations. And the pictures that I put on the screen here are as a contrast to the previous one, where there's all that color, texture, and depth going on. People with alexithymia generally report very few emotional descriptions about themselves. They can usually say that they're glad, that they're sad, that they're mad, or perhaps that they're surprised. And there might not be that much more in the repertoire. So a little bit more information about alexithymia. So people generally have difficulty in identifying and describing their emotions, feelings, and sensations inside the body, which you might call a limited palette. It's difficult for them to have subtlety within it. And I found a description that a lady gave who suffers from alexithymia, who said, "I often got up to go to work, only to discover later that I was sick, and I had to go home." So for her, it had to become quite intense before she was able to pick that up. "If my husband didn't remind me about meals, I would forget to eat and drink." So she wasn't feeling thirst and hunger in the same way as others. "I get very hot or cold sometimes and don't notice until I get really uncomfortable." So again, it has to become an extreme before she's aware of it. "I often get dehydrated." Now that last part is also something that is unfortunately the case for an increasing amount of people as they get older. There are lots of older people sitting around at home or in hospitals who are dehydrated without realizing it. And as I said earlier, it's one of the interoceptive senses that decreases in capacity over time. And it seems to be that there is a wide-ranging decrease in our interoceptive capacity as we go through life, unfortunately. So that's something that is being investigated to try and understand what the origin of it is. Is that because the brain is generally deteriorating as it does, as the rest of the body does as we age? Or are there other processes at play as we age to do with our emotions, our interactions with other people, or our relationship with ourselves, or perhaps the experiences that we have in our long life that make us less prone to want to check in perhaps in the body? So are there different compensatory mechanisms going on that we're getting used to? Perhaps the body's getting older and there's more pain, and therefore overall we sort of unconsciously turn down our overall ability to sense inside. For those of you who work as therapists of various kinds, you may also have found with people that when they start their personal transformation work in therapy, they sometimes, after a bit of time, start to become aware of all kinds of uncomfortable sensations in themselves that they never had before, which is, you could say, an unfortunate side effect of doing work on themselves, but it also means that they're starting to awaken to their own inner experience. Interoception is returning. Okay, so just a few things now as we come towards the end of this first part of the presentation to do with the power of naming feelings. So people who are able to name their feelings with more subtlety have what's called higher emotional granularity. Granularity is to do with the word granule, which is a little piece of something, for example, coffee granules. So the smaller and finer the piece, the more detail there is in the person's ability to name what is happening for them. So for example, if you have good emotional granularity, you'll be able, for example, to tell the difference between feeling regret and feeling remorse. That's an important one, again, in a court of law. Were you to be accused of a crime and you had indeed committed it and you expressed remorse, you are treated differently in the following process. Regret is different. It has a different, you could say, moral or less of a moral underlying than remorse does. And the same, guilt and shame are different. If you have emotional granularity, you'll feel the difference between them. So guilt is like, oh, I did it. Oh dear, I might get caught. I hope I don't get caught. And shame is feeling truly bad at a deep level in oneself because of that. So those are to do with emotional differentiations. But if you have alexithymia, you're one of these 1 in 10 people who suffer from that, then you're more likely just to be able to say, well, I feel fine or I feel bad. And what that then shows up as in one's life is that there's less resilience to being rejected. Because then instead of just saying, oh, they rejected me, I feel bad, and then feeling bad, you might say, they rejected me, I feel a little bit sidelined, or I feel not so important, or I feel that my sense of self isn't great today, or I feel a bit dejected. You know, if you have lots of other options, then you have opportunities to understand why you're feeling what you're feeling, and you might even be able to do something about it. Whereas if you just feel bad, there you are in the bad pot, and it's quite difficult to get work one's way out of it without much to work on, really. Also, people who have alexithymia, they're less likely to have different strategies to cope when they're unhappy. And unfortunately, a lot of the time, those coping strategies will involve alcohol or violence. Again, just to get the badness either dulled or out of the system onto somebody else. That's less likely if somebody has high emotional granularity and they can tell more of the difference, the nuances in how they're feeling. So just a little bit more on that. Studies have found that people with depression are less able to differentiate between negative emotional experiences. So the little emoticons there on the side are meant to show that if they're feeling negative in some way, they've got one category for that, although they're able to distinguish between different positive emotions. So they can feel the difference between happiness, being in love, feeling silly or surprised, whereas the bad category is one big blob, which again makes it hard to figure out what to do about. Because when we understand why we're feeling what we're feeling, then we have more of a choice to perhaps try and intervene or make something different happen. And then, of course, we don't have to control our feelings so much because we understand that there's something that we can do about them, and we can then try to target what we want to feel instead, or orient ourselves in a more positive way. So I've personally found that there are lists of emotions that are really helpful, both for myself and people that I work with, to try to support this emotional granularity, which I hope you're getting a sense of how important it is. As people develop their emotional granularity, that goes hand in hand with also developing better interoception. One source of an emotions list is on Byron Katie's website called thework.com. If you go there and look under resources, you'll find a very long list of emotions of things you never even thought you'd felt before. And if you then get into reading those and just taking on board that there are so many different options for what you might feel, then that can help support these processes of moving more quickly through negative emotions and supporting other people do the same, if that's within your remit in life. So just looking at a couple of the questions that came earlier, this was to do with when we were looking at the video where there was the hand being stroked by the paintbrush. And I was saying that when we are touched in an affective way, we get better ownership of the body. So the question is whether it doesn't conflict with being struck by the paintbrush. I don't think so. I actually think because the touch of the paintbrush is soft and gentle, the neuroplastic processes are updating our representation of ourselves even faster. Whereas if it was a very hard touch that was happening, we might not be as likely to want to update our body map as quickly. Whereas the soft touch is obviously affecting us in a different way where we take ownership of that much more quickly. And then there's a question about universal feelings versus Barrett's take on it. I am currently in the middle of weighing that up for myself as well, this idea of, are there universal feelings in the world that all cultures feel, no matter where you're born, you're going to have access to the same basic emotions, versus the idea that it's to do with our experience, and therefore we're getting an emotion based on what we're kind of precipitating, might happen next, or anticipating. So I have not got a definitive take on that myself at the moment. I'm trying to take in a lot of information about it to inform myself, and I really welcome dialogue and resources around that. I think it's a huge debate at the moment. I had a little bit of a kind of moral crisis myself when I went in and spoke to my PhD supervisor about it and said, what if all emotions are just like constructs of our past experience? What does that mean about interoception? But the fact of the matter is, there is research that's showing both points of view at the moment, so we don't discard anything. I think we need to continue putting more research towards this, more thought, more reflection, more experience, until we might get to a perspective where both of those could perhaps be accommodated within a larger theory. And that might sound like a bit of a cop-out, but I don't think that the final word has been said on this yet, and I don't think it's one of those two camps. I think we are looking at a greater thing that both of those sort of belong in. So we're coming towards the end of the first part now. I'm going to give you a break in just a moment, just to recap what we've done here in this first part, what we arrive with in this body. We don't really have to do much. We have these senses that we're born with. How we use our body and how we perceive the world changes the way that we think and we feel. We are not body or mind. We are body and mind and world. So on that note, we're going to have a little break of 4 or 5 minutes, and during that break I want to play for you a poem by Thich Nhat Hanh, which he was inspired to write after he was approached by some boat people who were being subject to violence from some sea pirates, and after he heard about the hardships that were happening in Uganda. And he found in himself a movement of judgment against the people who are persecuting others or causing them hardship or pain or terror. And he wanted to come back to a place of compassion in himself. And from that arose this poem, which is called Call Me By My True Names. So I'm going to play that while we have a break for those of you who would like to listen to that, and then we'll resume with part 2 of this presentation afterwards.
Call Me By My True Names by Thich Nhat Hanh. Do not say that I'll depart tomorrow, because even today I still arrive. Look deeply. I arrive in every second, to be a bud on a spring branch, to be a tiny bird with wings still fragile, learning to sing in my new nest, to be a caterpillar in the heart of a flower, to be a jewel hiding itself in a stone. I still arrive in order to laugh and to cry, in order to fear and to hope. The rhythm of my heart is the birth and death of all that are alive. I am the mayfly metamorphosing on the surface of the river, and I am the bird which, when spring comes, arrives in time to eat the mayfly. I am the frog swimming happily in the clear pond, and I am also the grass snake who, approaching in silence, feeds itself on the frog. I am the child in Uganda, all skin and bones, my legs as thin as bamboo sticks, and I am the arms merchant selling deadly weapons to Uganda. I am the 12-year-old girl, refugee on a small boat, who throws herself into the ocean after being raped by a sea pirate. And I am that pirate, my heart not yet capable of seeing and loving. I am a member of the Politburo, with plenty of power in my hands, and I am the man who has to pay his debt of blood to my people, dying slowly in a forced labor camp. My joy is like spring, so warm it makes the flowers bloom in all walks of life. My pain is like a river of tears, so full it fills the four oceans. Please call me by my true names, so that I can hear all my cries and laughs at once, so that I can see that my joy and pain are one. Please call me by my true names, so I can wake up, and so the door of my heart can be left open, the door of compassion.
So, welcome back after a little break. Those of you who were listening to Thich Nhat Hanh's poem, I hope you enjoyed it. I was very moved by it the first time I heard it. And I think it's a wonderful reminder of the interconnectedness of all of us, and the perhaps responsibility that we have to try and find compassion even when we would want to distance ourselves or separate ourselves from that which is happening in the outside world. Because, as I hope you're getting a sense of during this presentation, what we think is informed by our body, and our body's experience is informed by the world. We are part of all of that, even if we would like to sometimes believe that we're not. So, just before we begin the second part of the presentation, I used the break very effectively to look up a little bit of information on this point that was brought up in the first part about this power posing business. Remember Wonder Woman standing there, and there was a question about whether she hadn't taken back some of the findings that she'd presented originally in that TED talk. And what I came across just now in Sage Journal's publication is a 2017 article by Cuddy, Schultz and Foss, who have been able to rebut the critique that was made of their original study using an even larger data set. So it looks like that the findings that they originally had were based on sets of data collected from different studies, and a set of researchers then reanalyzed that those 34 studies and found that actually those results didn't hold true statistically in the way that they were analyzing them. But what Cuddy has then done since with her colleagues is analyze an even bigger data set, including those 34 studies, but included 55 studies in total. And they found that their results are still valid. So there is still statistically strong evidence that when we do these power poses, there is a very real effect of that. So for those of you who want to look into that in more detail, the article is called P-curving, so the letter P, as in a p-value, P-curving, a more comprehensive body of research on postural feedback, reveals clear evidential value for power posing effects. Reply to Simmons and Simonson 2017 by Cuddy. Okay, so let's, I love that you're asking questions so that we can update our knowledge together. It's wonderful that we can try and get as wide a view as possible by putting together what you've heard, what I've come across, so that it remains as up-to-date as possible, and also just as open-minded as possible. In science, I don't know if there is anybody who yet holds the ultimate truth on anything, so we're all figuring it out as we go along. So in the second part of the presentation, we've got an hour left or so now. We're going to start looking at what we can do with our physical body to change our cognition and emotion in a much more deliberate way, and hopefully gain benefits that we can reap over time. So here we're going to be looking at some practical interventions for different age groups, But I'm also going to talk to you about more neuropsychology now, which is the field that I'm researching predominantly. So we're going to be learning about different types of functions that the brain has and how you can test those in yourselves so that you understand more about how those interventions I'm going to talk to you about affect different aspects of the cognitive functions. Okay, so here we go. To start us off, we are going to look at a picture of a shoe. You may be familiar with this particular brand of shoe. It's called ASICS. What you might not be aware of is that ASICS is in fact an acronym, and it stands for an old Roman dictum, which is anima sana in corpore sano. And that was written by a poet called Juvenal as the first item on a list he collated of desirable things to have in life. So he said, the first and foremost, most desirable thing to have in life is a healthy mind in a healthy body, which is the translation of. And if you then take those letters, that makes ASICS. So for those of you who wear those shoes, did you know that you are wearing a very old piece of Roman wisdom and the most desirable thing to have in life? There we are. I don't know if they use that in their corporate advertising, but it's interesting. So we're going to be looking at the effects of physical exercise, and I thought to start us off, let's look at the brain of somebody really famous. So the next slide is going to be showing you pictures of a dissected brain of somebody who was alive at one point. So just to let you know, to warn you. So this is a real brain, and it's the brain of none other than Einstein. So his brain was preserved within hours of his death, and what was interesting about the dissection of Einstein's brain was that, of course, they were trying to find the source of genius. And to their great dismay, the first dissection that was done did show something incredibly unusual, but it wasn't what was expected. Later reanalysis of dissections have shown that there were connections in his brain that were unusual. Statistically, in comparison to other people, these days much more is known about what connections are standard and what not. But I'll tell you about what they did see at the time, which is to do with our topic now. So if you look at the top picture of that brain, I'm going to try and get a cursor here on the screen so you can see. So if you were to look here at that place that's red on the brain that says K, that is located just in front of the red line, which is the central sulcus. So we're looking at a brain from the top as though the person were lying down and their nose is pointing straight in the air, okay? So that central sulcus is the division between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe behind it. And what's right in front of that central sulcus? Well, it's the motor cortex. This is the part of the brain that I mentioned earlier that lights up when we read certain words like kick or pick, etc. Now, what Einstein had in his brain is what's called the omega sign. So those of you who are familiar with the Greek letter omega, this is an upside down omega that you're looking at, okay? So if you turn that upside down, you would have an omega that sort of looks like that. And it's on the right side of his brain. So for those of you who don't remember, the right side of the motor cortex controls the left side of the body and vice versa. So I'm not going to expect you to remember what part of the body is represented, exactly where that omega sign is, but you just have to take my word for it when I tell you that that part of the motor cortex represents the little finger. So why on earth would Einstein have this huge gyrus on that side of his brain in the area of the little finger? Well, that's because Einstein was a fiddle player. And when you hold a fiddle, so this is my left hand, this little finger is much more active than it would be on any ordinary person who's not a fiddle player. So most of us are right-handed, so we use the left hand less, and we certainly don't have the same kind of mobility and dexterity in our left hand unless we have a very good reason for it. And if you imagine that there's Einstein, holding the bow with his right hand and using that little finger to make all of those notes on the strings of the fiddle, that explains the omega sign. And in fact, you can see that in the brains of deceased string players, for example, people who play the violin in orchestras. And you also see what's called a bilateral omega sign, which means it's on both sides of the brain, in people who are concert pianists, because they also have very good reason for their little finger to be much more mobile, active, and strongly used than other people. So that is just a very small sign to tell you that what you do with your body in life affects the gross anatomy of your brain, okay? So there's Einstein. For those of you who are interested in knowing more about the other things that were found later on by retrospective analysis, you can look those up. If you look up Einstein brain anatomy, frontoparietal connections, there's some very interesting things that were found about the way in which he processed the senses of his body. He said something along the lines of, any idea that comes, he senses it first in the body. So ideas for him weren't cognitive, disembodied concepts, they were embodied, which is of course wonderful given the sort of presentation that we're doing here. So the brain develops through our lifetime. I think most people are aware of that, but what people weren't aware of until the last sort of 20, 30 years in psychology, now in developmental psychology, is it's not just children whose brains are developing, it's through the lifetime. And we are now finding different ways that we can support the development of the brain and its capacity and the preservation of functions at different life stages in specific areas of cognitive ability. So the ages we're going to look at now in this part of the presentation is more or less childhood, so that's shown on here as early development. What can we do to support the development of the brain to come into a powerful, able, versatile, fluid organism that can support it through life? As we come into younger adulthood, which you'll be delighted to learn, spans from 18 to 55 in most studies, right? I found myself delighted to be a young adult still. That's health maintenance. So how can we continue building, supporting our cognitive reserve? That means how much redundancy we have in the brain that can help us carry out functions, even if part of them should go missing later. And then as we move on into older adulthood, how can we start to work preventatively to slow down the decline that does come with age? So there's a point here on the slide where you can see there's a divergence. If we start to do things proactively to improve our memory, the curve can kind of be sustained to an extent. And there may also be the onset of diseases that makes a much faster downward curve happen as the cognitive decline of age takes place. Okay, so I'm showing you this to motivate you. And this next slide, if this one hasn't done it, I hope this one does it, which is to do with our brain shrinkage. Okay, I first read this and I was horrified. So then I did as much as I could to educate myself about the possible preventative things we can do to stop this. So longitudinal studies, that means studies that are done over years on the same people. Every year you measure them again and again to see what happens to them, show that the brain has a decrease in volume year on year between 0.2 and 0.5%. You might think, well, that doesn't sound like much. You know, what's a fifth or half of a percent? But if you add that up over 5 years, 10 years, that does start to become more significant. Now, the hippocampus, as you might remember from last time, is an area in the brain that's specifically to do with memory encoding and retrieval. It also has other functions. That shrinks between 0.79% to 2% every year from when we're 30 and onwards. Oh my gosh, that's a lot of shrinkage of an area of the brain that's helping us remember things, and it's specifically to do also with spatial memory. So if you think about it, one of the signs of getting older is forgetting where one puts one's things. So that could, to an extent, be ascribed to this shrinkage specifically of the hippocampus, which stores something to do with the quality of our memories. So for example, if you drive to work every day in a car or on a bicycle, do you remember where you parked your car or your bicycle that day? Not just the car park, but where in the car park. That sort of stuff really shows up in the shrinkage of the hippocampus when that starts to be an issue. And scarily, there are some areas of the brain that shrink as much as 25% by the time that we hit 80 years of age, if we grow that old. So between those ages of sort of 30 and 80, the brain can have shrunk by a quarter of its total volume. I first heard that and I had images of the brain sort of rattling around inside the skull. But what actually happens is the space that has become empty through the shrinking fills up with fluid, so there is no brain rattling going on, thankfully. But it is an actual shrinkage in terms of neurons. Now, the pattern of shrinkage is different for grey and white matter. You'll remember the grey matter sits predominantly around the outside of the brain. It's the cell bodies, it's the little helper cells that live out there as well. So in the frontal lobe, there's a kind of gradual shrinkage of grey matter across the brain, actually. of about 14% between the ages of 30 and 80. So over those 50 years, 15% of the frontal lobe, which is where we inhibit our behavior, where we multitask, where we judge the importance of things, where we shift our attention between things, and 15% of that is gone in volume. The hippocampus shrinks about 13% in grey matter over the same time. White matter is a different story. So while it shrinks about 24% between the ages of 30 to 80, which is a lot more than the grey matter. Remember, the white matter is the fast motorway connections between areas of the brain that allow us very quick processing, right? So a quarter of the frontal lobe white matter shrinks between 30 and 80, but the decline is very specific in time. It's precipitous, which means it's like falling off the edge of a cliff between the ages of 70 and 80, because at the age of 70, most people have only lost 6% of volume, but by the age of 80, they've lost 24% of volume. So you can see that building up cognitive reserve before the age of 70 and then continuing to try and preserve it just at that time as we might start or to want to maybe physically slow down a little bit or take it more easy, it's actually important that we do what we can to stop that decline to the extent possible if we're interested in keeping up our cognitive ability. So having said that, I hope I can put a little bit of fear into you there, just so you'll learn better, because of course, emotions allow us to remember things better unless we're, completely freaked out. I want to take you through the different areas of cognitive function, because the studies that have been carried out on the brain as it ages are related to specific functions, because of course, we need to know what we're measuring. So here, in what I just showed you, they were measuring the brain as a kind of volume, right? But that doesn't really tell us much about what it's doing. Sure, you might say the hippocampus is shrinking a little bit. Okay, memory is affected, or the frontal lobe is shrinking. Maybe they'll become less able to multitask or prioritize or make good judgments about things. But what about measuring those on a task-based performance basis? So actually giving people tests for those things. So I'm going to take you through the areas of cognitive function that I've collated together from different approaches to this. So I'm sorry to say that there isn't really one standardized approach to categorizing cognitive function. There are multiple ones, but what I did as I was researching this was I put this together from a few different systems to have something that's relatively concise and workable. So you're not going to see exactly this one anywhere else, but you will see, if you read into this, it's an amalgamation of other systems. So there are 5 in this particular approach here of cognitive function, those being cognition, which is about how we handle information, receiving, handling it, and outputting it. Emotionality, which is with our feelings and our motivation for doing something. Executive functions, which is about how we are regulating our behavior. Attention, which is a kind of foundation for the other functions. If we don't have attention, it's quite difficult to take in anything or regulate anything because we're not there. And then processing speed as a second foundation. Processing speed changes the other cognitive functions substantially depending on how fast or slow it is. And all of those are, of course, heavily interlinked. It would be impossible to talk about cognition without also thinking a little bit about how fast something is being processed or how slowly. How can you talk about attention if you're not also talking about how you're implementing that? What are you using the attention for what you're looking at or what you're trying to not look at, etc., right? So they're all very interlinked. So I'm going to talk to you in detail about each of them and give you some tests so you can test yourself in each of these areas. So let's see what we've got time for today. It might be that some of it you need to do if you review this recording at a later date. So we're going to start with cognitive function, the first one. And this picture that you see now on the screen, I'm going to use that on every single slide where it's a study to do with cognition, okay? So what you're seeing here is essentially a breakdown of how cognition works. There is a receptive function through our eyes, through our ears, through our touch, where we are receiving information from the outside world and from our inner experience. Remember interoception, right? So all of that stuff is going into the machine. And then it gets classified, it gets integrated, and then maybe if we choose to, if we like it, or if it made a big impact, we store it, and then we can retrieve it later as well. And thinking is also a cognition process where we later on sit and mull things over. We go, oh, I saw this and I saw this, and what does that mean? And we start to organize things and sort of put them in boxes and stuff, a little bit like I've tried to do with these cognitive functions. And social cognition is also a thinking function, trying to imagine what another person is thinking or feeling. We have to use these other parts of cognition to do that. And then finally, once we've done all of that and gone through it in our minds, we might choose to express it either in words or through some kind of behavior. So we're using the motor system to do that, or we might write it. So a way of acting on the information that we've acquired. So all of that, and you might think, well, what else is there other than all of that, right? Well, it's one dimension of cognitive functions. So all of that comes under this vast category of cognition, which this machine here is representing for us. So a common test of cognitive ability is this figure here on the screen. Now, we've got 40 minutes left, so I'm just thinking whether I'm going to ask you to do this one, because there's a couple of other things I would like you to do. You know what? I'm just going to ask you to do one thing with it. So if you have a pen and paper, it is to make a copy of this, okay? So just take a moment or so now while I tell you a little bit about this figure. So listen to my voice while you're looking at the screen and see if you can make a copy of what you're seeing here on the screen. And I'm going to give you a bit more information during that minute, okay? So this is a figure that was conceived to measure if there are different types of cognitive impairments going on in different areas. And for those of you right now who've grabbed pen and paper and are trying to replicate this figure, you are using your visual perceptive sense and your motor ability to put this onto paper. So, of course, the brain doesn't work quite as simply as in through the eye, out through the hand. There is lots of processing that's happening in between those two places. And already you can see when in clinical neuropsychology, for example, if you ask somebody to copy this figure, if they make a little bit of a dog's dinner out of that and there's huge pieces missing or it's upside down or rotated, it's an indication that there might be certain neurological problems going on or certain types of psychological deterioration that are happening. So hopefully most of you will find it a pretty easy task. I know there's a lot of details on it, but just to make a copy of that. So it's obviously named after somebody called Ray and Osterrieth, who came up with this, and it's used extensively in psychology. So when you've finished making the copy of it, just put it to one side. And what's then usually the case is that later on, after a period of a couple of minutes, you would be asked to draw it again from memory, okay? I'm not going to ask you to do that during this call unless you particularly want to. You can pick it up again in a few slides time when it's disappeared. But what you can do is the delayed test, which is to try and draw it after this call in 30 to 40 minutes time, okay, and see how much you retain of it. That tells you something about your visual and spatial memory, all right? And you can go back over this recording later on and refer to this next slide I'm showing you here, which is how you give yourself a score. So you would look at each of the areas of this drawing and score yourself from 0 to 2 based on a few things. For example, is it absent? So here's, for example, item number 11 is the circle with 3 dots. Some people misinterpret that as a face and it comes out as a little smiley when they draw this again later on. So if that's not present, you would get 0 for that item. If it is present, but you drew it as a smiley, but it was in the right place, you would get 1 point. If it was placed poorly, for example, outside or in another one, you'd get half a point. And if you've got the correct unit placed poorly, 1 point. And if it's placed completely correctly and it looks right, 2 points. So you can score a total of 36 points by using this scoring mechanism here. Okay, so that's just to talk you through one of the ways in which this is done. And if we were here in person and there was a little bit more time, I would go through that with you and we would have a right laugh looking at how you're replicating this thing. But we'll move on now to the next cognitive function. So the next one is emotionality. And this has 2 broad subcategories within it, which is feelings, which we've spoken about a bit already in the first part of the presentation, as subjective and often physiological experience. So that was what was being referred to as emotion, physiological. And then the second dimension of emotionality is motivation. So you can perhaps sense how they're a little bit different, but they're also quite connected. So if we are motivated, we are able to, what's called in neuropsychology, initiate an action which is the opposite of procrastinating, when we're initiating other actions. And we're also able to maintain that behavior until we get to the completion of it, right? So we might, in our motivation, be quite good at one, which is starting it, but we don't finish it. Or it might be that if somebody starts it for us or helps us to start it, then we're quite good at bringing it to an end. Or we might just not start or finish anything, so that's a kind of broader motivational issue. So I'm not going to do any emotional tests on you here. We're probably in the company here of people who are quite emotionally literate, given that you've turned up for this presentation. So there are various ways that can be tested. It's often to do with an interview of somebody, or getting a sense through the people who are close to somebody if they have emotional things. Or you can also test people's motivation by also asking them to do difficult, tedious tasks. So I think most people already know if they've got problems in either one of those feelings or motivation areas. So let's get instead to the next one, which is executive functions. Now, we spoke a bit about that in the first Neuroscience and seminar. So just to go through it again with you, it contains various different types of skills that are to do with how we regulate our behavior. So I chose this doctor here on rollerblades, taking notes on her clipboard, being on the phone, trying to use a stethoscope, while obviously having a little bit of a problem with how to prioritize all of that at the same time. So one of the executive function skills is set shifting. That means that we can be engaged with one thing and then move to another, and then move back to the other thing if necessary, and then accommodate another thing. It's what we sometimes call multitasking, but effectively we're not really multitasking. We're just quickly and efficiently shifting between different sets of information or requirements that are around us. So that's the first executive function. Another one is working memory. So that's about taking in information and updating it as we're going along so that we can continue working with it in its most relevant form. We'll see more about that in the test that I'm going to apply on you very soon. Then there's inhibition. So that means that you might have something that would naturally be your response in a situation, for example, cookie on a table, and you're thinking, I want it, but you know it's not for you, it's for some child that's in the room. So if you have inhibition, you'll be able to stop that hand reaching out and grabbing the cookie and causing mayhem. And not just that, also with responses that we might have to situations, knee-jerk reactions, etc. So being able to inhibit those and control how we express them. And then generativity, an interesting word. It means efficient access to long-term memory. So here's an example. If I said to you, name as many animals as you can that begin with the letter B, you'd probably start with bee, bison, buffalo, bulldog. I know I'm doing quite well here. That's to do with generativity, because you're generating responses based on longer-term memories that you're holding while you're accessing them in a specifically regulated way. So that's also an executive function ability, along with a memory ability. And then there's fluid reasoning, which is really something that we develop through our childhood into our adolescence, and we really only peak at as we come into our 20s and later, where we're able to problem solve with a high level of abstraction. That's required, for example, to understand one problem and apply the solution from that problem to a completely different set of problems. For example, how they first flew a rocket to the moon. Nobody had done that before, but there were various pieces of maths that had been solved that could be abstracted and put to a new kind of thinking to solve a problem. So that's what's known as fluid reasoning, putting things together in a new way. Okay, so I would like to offer you a test of executive function. So what you see on the screen in front of you is a cartoon that has been jumbled up. And I've made this quite difficult for you because I'm expecting that I have a literate and well-functioning audience here. So normally these tests are done with perhaps just 3 pictures if you're testing for somebody who might have certain types of neurodegenerative diseases going on. But I've given you 12 just to up the ante. So what I would like you to do is have a go at putting these in the right order. Okay? So you might want to write this down on a piece of paper, for example, and just have a go over the next minute or two at figuring out what is the beginning of this story and where does this end? And what on earth happened in between? So I'll just give you a bit of time to have a go at that. Normally, of course, in a clinical setting, you'd be given quite a long time to do this, but I'll just give you a little bit more time to at least try and work out where it begins and where it ends. So we'll see if we can get some consensus going on that. So if you think that you know what the first vignette out of these is, from A to L, would you be willing to type that in the chat box now? If you think you know, where does this story begin? What is the first one? So we've got somebody who thinks it's B. Okay, so we've got the chap trying to get in. Any other takers than B for this one? Ah, we've got two who think it's E. Okay, well, congratulations, E people. Indeed, it begins with E. So the story begins with a person coming outside saying, please go get me my comics newspaper, and he sends out the dog to do that. Then what happens? Has anyone got a stab at what is the next vignette that goes after E? Yes, we have some correct guesses here. It is indeed 8. The dog destroys the newspaper, right? And then, I'm not going to go through all of them with you, but various things happen in the story. Have you worked out what is the last picture of this story? Where does it end? That's right. It is indeed G, where he finds himself in prison. And obviously, terrible things have happened in between. So I'm just going to give you the answer on the next slide so we can just enjoy this comic. So there we have him. Dog destroys newspaper. He tries to recover it. Oh dear, he's locked out. And the clue that that wasn't the first one is that it's very subtle. But on the first one, the door is open on slide E. And on B, the newspaper is slightly more tatty and in pieces. So you'd have to be quite detective-like, but two of you did pick that up. And then, of course, he says, where's the key? He gets a rock. He smashes the window. He tries to climb in. There comes the dog, pulls off his pajama bottoms. Outraged elderly next-door neighbor goes, there's a naked man running around. He's arrested, uses the dog to protect his privates, and ends up in the jail cell, finally reading his newspaper there. So that is a classic test of executive function because it uses so many of those skills that we spoke about just before, shifting between different sets in the story, inhibiting your first response that would make you pick one and stick with it, allowing you to update your working memory representation as you're going through it, accessing through generativity your longer term memories, knowing what it means if somebody's thinking, oh, key, locked out, understanding that prison officer and prison go together, you know, all of those things. So one final little meta-cognitive test here. Is there anybody who can recognize what cartoon strip this particular cartoon artist normally draws? So this is a very, very famous cartoon artist. I'm asking you here to use your generativity, access your long-term memories. Where might you have seen this particular style before? Perhaps not this character. This is a new character that has emerged recently. But this is somebody who drew a very famous cartoon strip for many, many, many years. Any takers on that? See if we have any cartoon aficionados in the audience. So somebody has completely correctly said the Calvin and Hobbes guy. That is exactly who it is. He's called Bill Watterson. Well done. So that's, again, an executive function test where you are using fluid reasoning. There was something about that strip, perhaps the way that he drew the face or the way that the lines were drawn, or perhaps, I don't know, the irony of it. That is exactly Bill Watterson. He doesn't draw Calvin and Hobbes anymore, unfortunately. Great change, my favorite cartoon. But he does draw these other new characters now. So just a few tips for you, how to improve your executive function, something that you can get better at. One way, if you have a complicated task to do, is plan your time, okay? So here I kind of did that for you by saying we're only going to just spend a minute looking at this, but try to find the first one and the last one. So we had a rough plan and break it down in smaller tasks. So for example, with this task here, find the ones that go together first. For example, prison officer, prison cell, probably something there, something to do with the dog shaking, that might go together. And then rehearse your plan. Ideally, you might even speak it out loud. This is valid for anything that involves a complicated piece of project management. Plan your time so you know that you can deliver it. Break it down in smaller steps so it's not unsurmountable and you begin at the wrong end. and rehearse it a little bit so you can kind of sanity check it before you get stuck into it. But that's my advice for you and that of executive function researchers. Okay, so moving swiftly forward, another cognitive function, notice we're set shifting now away from executive functions, attention. So attentional functions come in 3 different flavors. They're really about maintaining the activity of the other cognitive functions. If we're not paying attention, then we're not really engaging with the other things we're supposed to be thinking about. There is sustained attention, which is what you are displaying as you're continuing, hopefully, to listen to the explanations, the illustrations that I'm giving you here. So you're keeping your attention in a sustained way. But you're probably also at the same time perhaps doing a little bit of divided attention. If any of you have children or pets in the house or something next door that needs your attention, you might at any moment be able to react if a sound or something should come into your peripheral vision. So you can also train your divided attention so that you're able to handle information from 2 sources at the same time. It could even be 2 different sensory sources. So it might, for example, be that you need to feel if there's a certain thing that happens to your hand. Does it suddenly get very hot because you're trying to warm up a kettle or something, while you're listening out for in the next room that the film is back on after the advertising break, right? That's an example of divided attention. And then selective attention. I'm sure we've all done that sometimes when there's something that somebody's saying, nearby that we really want to be listening to while somebody else in front of us is droning on about something that doesn't interest us. So we're kind of selectively with something else while we're drowning out something else while continuing to nod in that. Maybe that's just me. That's terrible. Anyway, so that's a different kind of attention as well, where we're actively tuning out what isn't useful for us. If we can't do selective attention, that's really, really hard if you find yourself in a school or exam situation, or even a public situation where you're trying to have a conversation with someone. So when the selective attention function goes in people with neurodegenerative disease, they find it really hard if there's a lot of stimulation going on at the same time. So the person I chose to represent that is somebody there who's obviously trying to text while they're not paying attention to the road and they're about to drop into the manhole. So I'm going to show you a video here called the Monkey Business Attention Test. And if you think you've seen this before, I advise that you pay attention anyway, because it might not be the one that you have in fact seen. Okay, so it gives you all of the instructions on screen. Just follow what it tells you. Here we go.
The monkey business illusion. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half miss the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it, but did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events. And that's the monkey business illusion. Learn more about this illusion and the original gorilla experiment at theinvisiblegorilla.com.
Okay, so for those of you who hadn't seen that before, I wonder if there was anybody here who did notice the gorilla the first time round, and if any of you didn't notice. It's quite a fun one. And if you're then looking for the gorilla, as he said, you probably or may have missed some of the other things that happened in that video. So that's to do with where you're putting your attention. So we'll move on to the other foundation of cognitive function, which is processing speed. And interestingly, processing speed was actually the very first cognitive function that modern science investigated. It's really to do with the speed at which we can complete an activity. So that both means the speed at which our motor movement can happen. So how fast, for example, this lady here who's representing the processing speed, how fast can she write and chuck pages over her back? And how fast can we put the pieces together when we're working on a problem? So with the task I gave you earlier to do with putting the cartoon strip into the right order, processing speed is also very related to that. Some of you might be able to do that within 2 minutes and get it all right, and somebody might take 10 minutes and get it all right. So your executive functions would be the same, but your processing speed would be different. And that study that it was first measured on was back in 1975, where they were looking at the reaction and movement time of younger and older men. They grouped them by whether they were inactive or whether they played racket sports like tennis. And they found that not just in racket sports and tennis, but in general life, the reaction and movement time of younger men was similar between the tennis and non-tennis playing groups. And the older men who did play racket sports had as fast reaction and movement times as the younger men, whereas the older men who weren't playing those sports were slower. So that gave the first evidence that if we are regularly physically active, we can actually stop some of the natural decline that happens to our brain as we grow older. So lots of research has been done since then, and I'm going to take you on a whirlwind tour through the different stages of life in the next 20 minutes. You, of course, don't have to remember everything I'm about to tell you. Just get the flavor of what I'm saying, and I'll sort of point out the highlights to you as we go along. So again, on each slide, if you look at the cartoon character that appears, that tells you the cognitive function this is related to. So here we have that multitasking doctor, which is to do with executive function. So we're going to start talking about the studies on children. So these are all different studies that have been conducted, primarily randomized control trials or really big studies. So the evidence that I'm showing you here is of a very high quality. These are not tiny little studies. So what they did here was they had a group of 7 to 9-year-olds, and they watched over 9 months what happened if you made a group of them do physical activity after school. And they noticed that there were improvements in executive functions. Specifically, the children who were doing the after-school activity were better at inhibiting themselves, which means not just doing the first thing that occurred to them, and shifting between tasks. And they also tested this via EEG to make sure that this wasn't just an effect of wanting to be good and participating in the study or something else going on. And they could actually see on the EEG that there was a different kind of activity in the brain during attentional tasks to do with inhibition. So this wasn't some random finding or a different factor. There was an actual rewiring in the brain's activity that had happened because of that after-school activity. So that's a pretty strong piece of evidence. We move on. Again, another study on children showing that 20 to 40 minutes daily of running around and skipping, so that's aerobic exercise, it gets up the pulse, uses the cardiovascular system. Overweight children between 7 and 11 doing that improved their inhibition, again, so we've got multitasking doctor there, and their mathematics scores in class. Now, how random is that? They're running around and skipping after class 20 to 40 minutes daily, and they're getting better at maths. So if you break that down a little bit, the sort of skills that are required in maths are to do with thinking, which is processing information, weighing it up, putting it into categories, figuring out what to do with it. It's to do with working memory, so holding the numbers in your mind long enough to be able to do operations on them, and fluid reasoning. You might learn that 1 + 1 is 2, but what do you then do with that plus sign when it's 2 + 3? You have to then understand that you still put them together, right? So that's cognitive functions as well as executive functions, and that they used an fMRI to show that there were indeed structural changes in the brain happening during the inhibition tasks. So again, this was not a random finding. This was to do with the exercise that they were doing. Moving on, just building up the evidence here for you, right? Again, something to do with executive function. So here, it wasn't over a year or 9 months that they did the exercise. This was children who were asked to do acute exercise, which means in that moment, 20 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic exercise on a treadmill. So this is not something they were doing for weeks and weeks. It was literally just 20 minutes during the study. And it was found that that improved their inhibition when they were tested before and after doing the exercise. And even more than that, they found that the children who had the biggest problems with inhibitory control had the biggest benefit from doing the exercise. Those who had less problems with inhibition already had some benefit, but it wasn't as big as those with the major inhibition problems. So that's called a differential effect on children with the varying existing levels of inhibition. And doesn't that just tell you something about the kind of lunacy, it's my own personal opinion now, of making children sit for many, many hours at a time without moving in class and expecting them to continue behaving well? So we're going to get into that now as I show you a few more slides on this. So when there is more physical education in primary schools, so that's younger children, 9 to 10, they are better at concentrating, which is an attentional function. Okay, so here we have the little person trying to multitask. They get better at paying attention, sustaining attention, and selective attention when they are directed to do physical education. And so now we're going a little bit back in time to, when some of these studies were done in schools. So just to prove the thing I was talking about earlier, it's good for children to move around. So someone called Hervé in 1952 proposed reducing the academic curriculum in French schools by 26%, right? So a quarter less academic contents in favor of physical exercise instead. So 1 out of every 4 classes was dropped that was academic, and instead they did sports. They retained the same academic results. They had less discipline problems and less people going absent, which you could say is to do with motivation, perhaps. And they had better attentiveness, which is to do with attention. That study that was originally done in France was replicated in Australia with similar results. 1 hour less classroom time for physical exercise instead. Same academic results, better attention, better motivation all round. Okay. This is important for those of you who work with children or have children. They have to be allowed to move. So a meta-analysis now bringing multiple studies together. So 44 studies were analyzed on children between 4 and 18, like that's most of childhood right there, including healthy children, those with physical disabilities, and those with mental impairment. So really the full range here. It was found overall that their perceptual skills improved. So that's receiving information in the receptive functions. Their academic achievements were better, which involves cognition, executive functions, motivation. And there was a larger effect when they were doing physical exercise at the times where the cortical development is most intense. And that is between the ages of 4 and 7 and 11 and 13. So those, if you had to choose times for them to make sure they're doing physical exercise, would be those ages 4 to 7 and 11 to 13, as the brain at that point in time is in such a process of development that it makes a really big difference if they have the ability to, blow off some of that steam and get some of those positive benefits. We'll see later on a little bit about the processes of how this works. So what longitudinal studies have shown, the ones that follow people through years and years and years, is that those who start physical exercise early in childhood maintain and improve cognitive function through the later years in comparison to those who don't. Gulp. Right. I'm just trying to think back. Were we all active enough as children? So, carrying on, now we're going to move to young adults, all of us between ages of 18 and 55 now. If you go running for 30 minutes, 5 times a week, for 6 weeks, people tend to get improvements in their visuospatial memory. So remember, those people walking around the memory palaces, they were actually, while they were doing, if they'd been running, they would have also been improving their visuospatial memory. And they were improving their positive affect. So just notice that it's positive affect, the positive aspect of feelings. Younger adults improve those when they do aerobic exercise for 30 minutes, 5 times a week. There weren't any changes in this particular study in their verbal memory or in their selective attention or in their negative feelings. Positive feelings and negative feelings aren't kind of contrary. They're not, they don't reduce one another. They're 2 separate scales. you can at the same time feel you can score very highly on a negative scale of feelings, and you can score very highly on a positive scale of feelings. You might be somebody who just experiences feelings very intensely, and you might be somebody who scores very low on both of them. So it's not like they're a pair that move together like this. So in young people, negative feelings don't improve through exercise, apparently, in this study here, but positive feelings did become stronger. Just bear that in mind. Another study showed, again, so that was more chronic exercise, what we just saw. That was over like a number of weeks. Those studies usually 6 to 8 weeks. This one here is about a single bout of exercise, in this case running. So they asked people to run 4 hours after they had learnt some information to do with pictures and locations. Okay, they weren't running for 4 hours. They learned some stuff, they waited 4 hours, and then they went running for half an hour. And they found that the people who did that running 4 hours later had better scores in trying to remember the picture and location associations than those who didn't exercise, or those who exercised immediately after memorizing those pictures and locations. Very interesting. And this was again confirmed by MRI that there were specific patterns of activation even 48 hours later. So it wasn't just that the people who were doing running 4 hours later weren't doing lucky guesses. So there's something about physical exercise that helps to consolidate, make stronger memory encoding. More studies on young adults. When you do physical exercise over 3 months, it increases cerebral blood volume in specifically what's called the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus. And that correlates with improvements in cognition, specifically verbal memory. So if you are doing exercise over a period of time, that of course gets the blood pumping around the system. It looks like that also helps more blood pump around the brain. And it seems that when that happens, there's more of something called BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And that allows for the brain to grow. So there are only 2 places in the brain that after we reach adulthood is still making new neurons. One of them is a place that connects to the olfactory bulb, so potentially connecting new smells to things, learning new smells. That's not very strong in humans, so it's not very studied. But the other one is this specific place that's mentioned here, which is the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus. So I'm going to show you a slide now. This is mice. So these are sections of mouse brain you're looking at. The one on the left labeled A, those little black dots are neurons to be. So neurons that are in the process of being born. The one on the left are mice in a cage that didn't have a wheel for running. The one on the right, labeled D, are for mice that had a running wheel in their cage. Look at the difference. So there is a substantial difference in neurogenesis, the birth of new neurons in the brain, in the hippocampus, when there is the possibility and the use of physical activity. So that's an interesting study by Van Praag and colleagues from 1999. You can look about that. There's lots of things that have been done since then that have corroborated this as well extensively. So on that note, I'm going to give you a few concepts and things here, and I'd like you to tell me whether you think that these different things support or inhibit neurogenesis, the birth of new neurons. And these are from a TED talk by Sandrine Thuré called You Can Grow More Brain Cells, Here's How, which I highly recommend. Okay, so I'll just give you a few of these, and you tell me whether you think it supports or inhibits neurogenesis. Okay, I'm hoping you all know that running supports neurogenesis because we just looked at that, right? So what about sleep deprivation? Support or inhibit neurogenesis? Inhibit, that's right. So if we don't sleep enough, we are not going to get the same amount of new neurons in that part of the brain as if we're sleeping plenty. What about caffeine? Does caffeine support or inhibit neurogenesis? It supports it. Well done. Yes. So that's not obvious the one. You might think, oh, caffeine is evil, I'm doping my brain. But actually, it supports the genesis of new neurons. I skipped a few there. I'll show you on the next slide the answers to all of these. Let's just pick one more. Crunchy food. This is by a Japanese research team who are a little bit obsessed about the texture of food. Does crunchy food support or inhibit? So Indeed, it supports neurogenesis, which is quite fascinating. Soft food doesn't support neurogenesis. So, very good question here. Doesn't caffeine restrict blood flow to the brain? Well, caffeine can have a tonifying effect on the system, but it actually makes a lot more processes happen in the brain. So it speeds up our, that's the kind of effect of caffeine. It speeds up our cognitive function, and that requires more blood flow. So if there is a restricting blood flow effect, it's also pulling in more resources. And I guess in the pulling in of those resources to make all of those things happen that caffeine allows us to do, it's also generating this BDNF that makes the neurogenesis happen. So it's a very good question. So I'll just show you the next slide so you can see for yourself. Anything in green is good news for neurogenesis, and anything in red is bad news. So stay away from sleep deprivation where possible. Stay away from stress. Stay away from alcohol. Although you'll see in the TED talk that there is something, I think some kind of flavonoid or something or other in red wine that balances out the detrimental effects of alcohol. So if you are going to go to drink something, let it be a neurogenesis neutral drink, which is red wine. You can see the other ones in there, including calorie restriction of 20 to 30% is also really good for neurogenesis. All right, swiftly moving on. So more studies on young adults. There are actually structural changes that happen in the brain, particularly in the cerebellum. We haven't talked about that before, but it's a part of the brain that sits kind of at the base here of the skull that allows us to have finer motor movement. It kind of fine-tunes our ability to do various things. For example, dribbling a basketball or shooting hoops. Perfecting those is to do with the cerebellum's ability to kind of fine-tune what we're doing. So if you do a lot of sports, not surprisingly, there are going to be structural changes in the cerebellar region and also in the frontoparietal region, because of the amount of practice that's happening, a little bit like Einstein with the omega sign due to the little finger. So structural changes in the brain are happening as perhaps even structural changes in the body are happening due to sports. And you see that in badminton players, in golfers, in gymnasts. Their brains look different because of how they're using their bodies. So we're almost at the end of the young adults now. So MRI scans, EEG studies have shown that selective attention is better in young adults who exercise. So if you're finding that it's difficult for you to hold your attention, for example, if you're starting a meditation practice, it can be quite difficult to have selective attention, to tune out all that other stuff that's going on. Exercise could be your way in. Those MRI and EEG scans show that there is real brain change, and it's not just this problem that often happens in neuroscience and psychology tests where it's because the participants are doing a test over and over that they get better at it. If I asked you to draw that Ray Ostriath figure, you remember the one that I asked you to sketch earlier? If you did that 20 times, you'd probably be pretty good at it, but that doesn't say anything about your particular ability to retain information you've seen once. But the brain changes do give some evidence that there is something very real going on. So we've mentioned a few times now about exercise intensity and levels. So let me just demystify it completely for you so you can go forth now and plan your optimal exercise regime. Exercise intensity is very easily measured like this. If you are exercising and you can speak in full sentences without any interruption, just like I've been doing now for the best part of 2.5 hours, that's low intensity exercise. That's not going to do it. If you can say some phrases with gaps in between, that's moderate intensity. That's where you want to be. If you can't speak, you're exercising at high intensity. Pretty simple, right? So if you're running with a partner and if you're having intermittent conversation, you're at about the right level of exercise. So now the exercise levels, which is to do with frequency. Most of these studies show that the most benefit is at moderate levels, which means 3 to 4 times a week. Okay, you don't have to go for 5+ times a week. Lots of studies, in fact, show that there are similar results between moderate and high levels of exercise. 1 to 2 times per week might not be enough, but it's better than nothing. Okay, so we're quickly going to move through some of the studies in older adults so we can get to the end of the presentation. So here, I will just give you the big traits now. So older people over 55, there is a lot of evidence that shows if they are exercising at low to moderate levels, there is less likely to be cognitive decline. Massive metacognitive studies that have shown this, and over 34,000 people over 1 to 12 years of follow-up. So those who were doing high levels of physical activity, 38% less likely to have cognitive decline. Low to moderate, 35% less likely. So meta-analyses of randomized control trials, there's better executive function benefits, there is better processing speed, and there's better ability with visuospatial tasks if people are exercising. And remember I told you earlier when I was trying to scare you about the frontal lobe being one of those places where there's really a lot of loss in terms of volume? Well, exercise has shown that it really benefits in that area, and it's where age degeneration is one of the really strong ones in the prefrontal cortex location. So it's really worth preserving those functions for as long as possible through the means of exercise. Memory, spatial memory improvements over 1 year of physical exercise. This study showed they were able to actually reverse the loss of volume in the hippocampus. In participants with an average age of 67, they had more blood flow volume, they had more of this brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So there's some kind of neurogenic mechanism we looked at with the mice as well. And systematic reviews of randomized control trials show that if there isn't a cognitive impairment already diagnosed, then they can have better visual and attention, visual and auditory attention, they can have better processing speed. Meta-analyses showing that there's even a link between physical exercise and well-being. That might not surprise you. If we're exercising, this is the bit I asked you to remember earlier, for young people, there tends to be an increase in positive feelings. For older people, it tends to be that there's a reduction in negative feelings. So it's a bit of a difference as we age, but certainly something that's worth bearing in mind, as older people are often more prone to depression through loneliness and life experience. So exercise can help reduce those feelings. It was shown that it's aerobic and also resistive exercise, which means it involves a little bit of body weight at moderate intensity, which we know what means. You can breathe in between with gaps, moderate amounts, which means 3 to 4 times per week. That was the most beneficial for psychological well-being. Then finally, clinical population. So that means people who have various types of problems. Aerobic exercise improves executive function in those who are, it's more so than those who are receiving drugs for major depressive disorder, right? Worth bearing in mind. Aerobic exercise also helps executive function and attention and delayed memory recall. If you were going to draw the Ray Osterrieth figure now, that would be a delayed memory test in people who have mild cognitive impairment and dementia. So you can improve all of those, which really contribute to the quality of life. When people start suffering from dementia, not really remembering things or not being able to pay attention or not being able to plan their life like they used to, can be really depressing. So aerobic exercise can help bring some of that back to similar levels to before the loss started. In people with Parkinson's, executive functions can be improved. And in people with moderate heart failure, and you'd think, please don't exercise, your heart can't take it. In fact, suitable exercise over 18 weeks was shown to improve both executive functions and attention. So it's not that they shouldn't exercise because of the moderate heart failure, but just to find a way to do it so they can still reap those cognitive benefits. So why aren't we all exercising? You're probably bored to death now of hearing me sitting here saying, oh, you have to exercise, it's going to do all this. Why don't we do it? We know that our cognition, our emotions, our executive functions could benefit so much. So I looked into this so you don't have to give me your own excuses. I came up with a few things. One of them is the two-way relationship between physical activity and the brain. So studies show when you measure people from day to day during their work day, their weekends, their holidays, their activity levels don't actually vary that much. It only tends to be a 12% difference from day to day in our activity levels. So it might be that we kind of have a preset amount of physical activity that we do, and we're kind of born that way. So those of us who don't exercise just don't begin because it's not really who we are. That's one possible excuse. Another one is the society we now live in. We are in an increasingly sedentary society. We sit down a lot. We use cars. We use transport to travel around. We don't walk long distances. We don't run long distances unless we're training for something. 42% of the population in the European Union feel too short on time to do sports and exercise. So it's not something we're prioritizing. So it could be that it's a societal phenomenon that we're all kind of suffering from. A few more reasons. It could be that our lack of motivation and commitment to making change in the first place is stopping us from doing it. Remember when we were talking about motivation, sometimes we don't start stuff And sometimes we start stuff, but we don't carry on. Did you know, this is absurd, 67% of gym memberships are not used. So I guess it's a fantastic money printing mechanism for those who run gyms, but it really exploits this part of us where we have such an overconfidence about how we're going to manage, motivate, and control ourselves into the future. You know, we plan these days where we think, I'm going to do this. By the end of the day, we've done one of those things and then we feel terrible, you know, but we don't update our sense of ourselves and what we're actually able to do. And then the fourth and final reason that I came up with, that maybe you'll think of more for yourselves, is a lack of physical fitness. If we're not physically fit, it is hard to get motivated because it hurts and it's difficult. So it's a bit of a catch-22. If we are physically fit, it's easier to be motivated and focus on goals. Remember, exercise improves motivation. If we're not exercising, we have less motivation. There was a nice little study done on a section of young Danish men who were moderately overweight, young and sedentary, which a lot of the young population is these days in the European Union. They were able to develop more motivation for many different types of tasks in life when they were doing 30 minutes of aerobic activity daily. And this is good to bear in mind, there was also a group who were doing 60 minutes daily. They didn't lose any more weight than the ones who did 30. Okay, so don't overexert yourselves. 30 minutes is about right, 3 to 4 times a week at that kind of moderate intensity where you can speak with some gaps in between to catch your breath. We have come now pretty much to the end of this presentation, just to bring us all the way back to the beginning where, you remember I showed you that trainer that said A6, and I said that means animo sano and corpore sano, healthy mind in a healthy body. Juvenal, the Roman poet, wrote that. On that same list of things that he wrote about things that we could aspire to in life, he also wrote monstro quod ipse tibi possis dare, which means what I commend to you, you can give to yourself. Nobody else can do it for you. But if you take that first step, hop, skip, or jump yourself, you can improve your body and your mind and emotions as a consequence. And I love this little drawing here, beginning with, I am not going to do it. I can't do it. I want to. How do I do it? I will try. I can. I will. I did. So thank you very much, everybody, for your attention. We've reached the goal of the presentation today. I welcome any questions that you have left over. I'll hang around for a little bit. And just to remind you, there's another one of these talks coming up in 3 weeks' time on the 20th of July. If you're interested in creativity, one of the favorite subjects of mine about how creativity arises in the brain, how we can enhance some of those processes in ourselves, how it changes over life, and what happens when there's disease in the brain to those creative forces. So I have a long essay of about 7,500 words that I wrote on physical exercise and cognitive benefits. If anybody's interested in that, I'm very happy to send it to you. I can make that available as a download as well if you want to read about that in a lot more detail. The names of all the studies that I quoted today are in there, so you can enrich yourself with that, or just take away the summary of what I gave you today without any further pain. Thank you to those of you who joined me today, and until next time.